The barn was already half in flames when Dylan, barefoot and bleeding, dragged the last horse out, only to see Margaret, soaked and defiant, hurling water at the fire with her bare hands. In that moment, something shattered between them, and something else began. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The wind in Eden Ridge didn't howl. It murmured, low and constant, like the voice of something ancient that had seen too much to speak quickly. Dylan heard it most in the early mornings, when the frost still clung to the fence rails and the cattle moved slow and heavy. That first week on the ranch, he moved slower still. Each day began with the same mechanical rhythm. Feed the herd, clear the troughs, mend a wire, avoid conversation. It should have felt like peace, but it didn't. The silence out there wasn't empty. It pressed on the ribs. Margaret Lowell wasn't cruel. That was the first surprise. Dylan had expected a bitter woman, defensive, prideful, someone who barked orders and made demands, clinging to control in her twilight years. But Margaret was neither warm nor cold. She was distant, measured. Her voice, when she used it, had the steadiness of someone who'd lived through too many storms to be moved by one more. She didn't watch Dylan work, didn't question his choices. She offered no thanks and no scorn. She moved through the days with a stillness that felt, to Dylan, less like calm and more like mourning. He caught glimpses of her routines, steeping her tea leaves in a chipped porcelain pot at dawn, sweeping the front step before the dew dried, slicing apples with a precision that suggested she'd done it 10,000 times and still cared about the angle of the blade. Each motion told a story he couldn't yet read. And each evening, without fail, she sat in the same rocking chair with that same quilt on her knees, worn, hand-stitched, a mosaic of old flannels and floral prints, its colors faded by sun and sorrow. She never looked at him during these porch vigils. Her gaze always stretched westward, beyond the ridge, where the horizon turned lavender before the dark swallowed it whole. Dylan didn't ask questions. Not yet. He was here for land, not legacy. But something about her silence, its weight, its shape, chipped at him. One night, while rummaging through the feed shed for a lost wrench, he found a rusted tin box tucked beneath the stairwell. Inside, folded neatly, was a receipt for a wedding dress dated June 1968. And beneath it, a photo. A young Margaret, her smile radiant and unguarded, standing beside a man in uniform. Their hands were clasped. Her eyes looked like they still believed in forever. Dylan didn't sleep that night. The hills, which had once felt like opportunity, now felt like witnesses. And somewhere deep in his chest, the first thread of something unfamiliar pulled taut. Not guilt, exactly, but a growing sense that this ranch was more than a transaction. It was a mausoleum built out of loyalty. And he had walked in without asking the names on the graves. The padlock on the attic door wasn't heavy, just old. A single tug with the crowbar hanging off the stable wall, and it gave with a tired snap, as if even the building had grown weary of holding secrets. Dust swam in the air like memory made visible, catching the afternoon light that slipped through a warped window pane. Dylan hadn't meant to pry, but curiosity is a stubborn itch, and something in the quiet sorrow of Margaret Lowell had begun to scratch at the edges of his mind. The attic smelled of cedar and mouse droppings. Crates lined the wall, each marked in a woman's careful script. Winter linens, old spurs, Charlie. It was the last one that drew him in. The photo album lay beneath a bundle of folded letters tied with green ribbon, brittle with age. He opened it with the same hands he used to mend barbed wire, coarse, impatient, and immediately regretted it. The image hit him like a stray bullet. Margaret, young and full of breath, her cheeks lifted in a joy he hadn't yet imagined possible for her. She stood beside a man in a crisp olive uniform. He looked sturdy, kind, with a face built for grinning. Their fingers were linked like roots. The inscription beneath the photograph was written in blue ink, slightly faded. "My Charlie, my first and only love." Margaret's footsteps were soft, but the floor creaked its betrayal. She stood in the doorway, eyes steady on the open album in his lap. Dylan expected fire, fury, or at least a sharp word. Instead, she knelt, took the book from him gently, and shut it with reverent finality. "He was killed in Nam," she said, not looking at him. "We were married 6 months. This ranch is the only thing I had left of him." Then she left the room, leaving behind only dust and the aftertaste of truth. That evening, Dylan tried to cook. The kitchen was her domain, but he insisted. She sat at the table, watching with raised brows as he fumbled with peaches and flour, sweat beating at his temple. The oven smoke was thick by the time the crust turned black. Margaret didn't scold. She laughed. A dry, startled thing, like a door creaking open after years of rust. "You've managed to ruin Peaches," she said, her lips lifting into the ghost of a smile. "That's something." Afterward, he watched her in the kitchen window, humming softly as she rinsed the pie dish and set it out to dry. The way she moved, deliberate, calm, unhurried, was not the motion of someone surviving. It was the motion of someone remembering how. In the days that followed, Dylan began to see the ranch not as acres to be claimed, but as a living shrine. The horses she spoke to in low murmurs, the quilt she folded with care, the notebook where she copied verses in tidy cursive, all of it was stitched with longing, loss, and the quiet, tireless love of a woman who had once dared to give everything, and had never stopped holding on. The storm had crawled in low, cloaking the hills in a blue-black hush. No thunder at first, just the wind turning restless, brushing through the cottonwoods like an animal searching for an exit. Dylan had risen to check on the fence posts, the ones at the eastern edge that always leaned after a hard wind. That's when he saw it. A flicker at the edge of the barn roof. Orange at first, then red, like some devil's breath curling up into the night. By the time he reached the east barn, the flames had already begun their hungry climb. Shingles cracked, and the dry hay inside hissed as it ignited. Dylan didn't think. He didn't yell for help. He ran, barefoot, shirtless, heart pounding against ribs that suddenly remembered what it meant to fear. The horses screamed, their bodies thrashing against the stall doors in blind panic. The latch burned his palm as he freed the first one. He swore, barely noticed the skin peeling from his fingers. One by one, he guided them out. Chestnut, Bay, the old gray mare that limped when it rained. He didn't count them. He just moved. Then came the sound of splashing. He turned to see her. Margaret. Her hair was soaked. Rain and sweat mixed into a silver tangle. She carried a rusted bucket in each hand, flinging water onto flames that mocked her effort. The fire towered, swallowing boards and beams, but she didn't retreat. She was shouting, not words, just raw sound, as if defying the fire itself to take more than it already had. The barn collapsed before dawn. Charred beams smoldered like bones. The animals stood trembling in the corral, steam rising from their flanks. Dylan sat on the porch steps, feet blistered, shirt smeared with soot. Margaret sat beside him, still in her wet nightgown, her hands trembling in her lap. She said nothing at first, only stared into the blackened shape that had once been a barn, eyes too red for mere smoke to explain. Then, Barely above a whisper, she spoke. "I thought I was done loving anyone after Charlie." She paused, fingers tightening. "But when I saw you run into that fire, something changed." The next morning, sunlight slanted through the curtain like a promise. On Dylan's bed lay a cedar box. Inside, neatly folded, was the quilt. It was heavier than he remembered, as if stitched with something more than fabric. Time, perhaps, or trust. And at the center, a new square, deep navy, unfrayed, bearing 6 words in careful thread. "To the man who stayed." He held it to his chest, and for the first time in years wept. Not for what he had lost, but for what he had been given. The barn had been cleared of ash and sorrow, swept clean by neighbors who showed up in quiet waves after the fire, not out of pity, but out of respect. Margaret hadn't asked for help. She never did. But people came anyway, carrying shovels, plywood, and peach cobbler. They came because something had changed, and not just in the structure that burned. Something about the way Margaret Lowell stood beside her new husband, no longer behind him, not before him, but beside, had stilled the wind in Eden Ridge. Folks noticed. When word spread that the Lowells, they used his name now too, would attend the Sunday dance, mouths didn't so much gossip as marvel. The widow hadn't come to a social since the bicentennial picnic, not even after Sunday services, not even when her name was called for pie auction. But that evening, under the soft flicker of lanterns strung across the rafters of the town hall, she arrived. Her dress was calico, pale blue with faded daisies, a dress older than some of the women who paused mid-conversation to watch her cross the floor. Her silver hair was swept up, pinned delicately with a ribbon the color of dried lavender. Her arm was hooked through Dylan's, and though his boots were worn and his jacket too new, his grip was sure and gentle. The music started, an old waltz, slow and full of heartache, and Dylan turned to her. He didn't bow or show off. He simply held out his hand, palm up. Margaret hesitated. The room was too full, the air too thick with expectation. Her breath caught in her throat. Then he leaned in, his voice steady but low. "You're the strongest person I know." Something in her eyes broke open, not with pain, but release, like a dam lifting after years of silent pressure. She took his hand. Their dance wasn't polished. It didn't glide. It moved the way seasons change in Montana, deliberately, gracefully, with weight. Her steps were cautious, his protective, but each turn of the floor loosened something in the room. Conversations softened. Music settled like a warm shawl over weary shoulders. People stopped talking. Some dabbed at their eyes. A few couples, older than the rest, reached for each other's hands, long unused to such tenderness. And when the song ended, Dylan didn't dip her or twirl her. He kissed her hand, weathered, veined, strong, and spoke without ceremony. "I married you for your land, Margaret, but I'm staying because you showed me what love means." Her smile didn't tremble. "Charlie would have liked you," she said. And in that moment, surrounded by sawdust and fiddle strings, Margaret Lowell was no longer the widow of Eden Ridge. She was simply a woman loved and seen.